Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to who is with us on WebEx and to who is now joining us on some social media platforms. This event is starting very soon, 3 p.m. Geneva time, which is in 1 minute. We will now play a little teaser and we will later formally launch the event. Thank you for being with us.
Lisboa recebe o encontro decisivo para salvar o oceano, proteger o futuro. A Conferência dos Oceanos das Nações Unidas, organizada por Portugal e Quênia, decorre de 27 de junho a 1 de julho. Governantes e parceiros sociais debatem ações para implementar o Objetivo de Desenvolvimento Sustentável 14, que visa proteger a vida marinha. Em 2022, o futuro do oceano decide-se em Lisboa.
Excellencies, dear colleagues, good afternoon to who is in person at the International Environment House, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who is with us on WebEx or is now watching the video of the event. The Geneva Environment Network joins today the permanent mission of Kenya and the permanent mission of Portugal to the United Nations in Geneva, in warmly welcoming you for this second Geneva Blue Talk, organized in the run-up to the UN Ocean Conference, convening in Lisbon in a few weeks. In the run-up to this major conference, Blue Talks are taking place around the world to discuss the core issues that will be addressed at the conference, including in Geneva, where we are addressing issues that are both at the heart of International Geneva and of the UN Ocean Conference. We are highlighting through these talks the contribution of Geneva to the global ocean agenda and achieving SDG14. We have with us today leading experts deeply involved in ending harmful fisheries subsidies. Before we proceed with the opening remarks of this event, and I hand over to the moderator of today's session, Christophe Bellman, who is the head of policy analysis and strategy at the Forum on Trade, Environment and Sustainable Development Goals, known as TESS in Geneva. Let me remind for those who are online with us that you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, which we will address then your questions in the discussion session of this event. To launch and welcome you to the second session of the Geneva Blue Talks, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Duarte Bué Alves, the Consul General of Portugal in Manchester, an advocate of the ocean. Christophe will then take over after Mr. Bué Alves' remarks. Mr. Bué Alves, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from Manchester, UK. I'm very glad to join you this afternoon, dear ambassadors, colleagues, and friends. And I would obviously start by thanking you for the very kind invitation to Geneva Environment Network and the missions of Portugal and Kenya in Geneva for having invited me to these events. I've also, in my capacity as Consul General of Portugal here in Manchester, organized my own session of a Blue Talk here, and it's indeed a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Well, when it comes to the ocean, the truth is that I have bad news. I mean, we are all facing bad news, and the bad news is that the ocean is on fire. I'm not exaggerating. The situation is indeed very serious and very critical, and even more serious because we can't see that fire. It's not visible, but the situation is a cause for concern. I know that time is very short. I necessarily have to be concise, and I would just underline the three main problems that the ocean is facing. The number one problem is probably ocean warming and sea level rising. This is one of the most serious topics as a result of warming seas and melting of ice glaciers. And sea level rises, as we all understand, threatens coastal communities, destroys economic services. Let me give you an example of my own country. In the last 10 to 20 years, my country has lost 13 square kilometers. Portugal has lost 13 square kilometers that just disappeared because of sea level rising. The second problem we are facing is plastic pollution that, as we all know, continues to enter the ocean at an alarming rate. Plastic represents 84% of all pollution in coastal areas. And the third and final problem, I'm obviously being very concise and just touching the problems. The third and final problem is the fact that a third of fish stocks are overexploited. Our colleagues in FAO in Rome estimate that 1/3 of all fish stocks are caught illegally or are unreported or unregulated. This means that there is a very significant amount of fish that every year, every day, is entering the market without paying taxes, which are not controlled, are not respecting scientific quotas to preserve the future, to preserve fish stocks for future generations. And of course, linked to the fish, there is also the main issue that brings us together here this afternoon, which has to do with fish subsidies, one of the targets of SDG14. SDG14 number 6, target number 6. And SDG14 specifically addresses some of the issues I've just mentioned. The question of overfishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is addressed by SDG14 and must come to an end and give place to a science-based managed plan to restore fish stocks. And also, of course, subsidies, as you all know, probably even better than me, subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, as well as the EU illegally and unreported and unregulated circles. But I say that we have bad news, but the truth is that we also have good news. And that brings me to the topic of the issue of global ocean governance. It's true that the global ocean governance has a couple of mechanisms, tools, or even an architecture which sometimes is a bit dispersed. But we do have the tools. We have the Paris Agreement of 2015, where the word ocean is mentioned only once, only in the preamble of the text. We have, of course, the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. We have the Conference of the Parties of the UNFCCC, as the one that took place here in the UK, in Glasgow, a few months ago. And we basically have the instruments to stop those plagues. May I mention one a recent decision that you all know was taken in Nairobi during Unep 5, United Nations Environmental Assembly, that the parties committed to develop a legally binding instrument to beat plastic pollution. And as for overfishing, we also know what the instrument is. There is only one instrument and there is only one solution: control. We have again the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, but this agreement can only work if we all advocate for universal adherence. If all coastal countries are part of this agreement and exercise control, it will be almost impossible to bring illegal fishing into the markets. So we do have plans for ocean governance. I don't think we lack plans, and we have the legal framework within which all activities must be carried out. I'm speaking obviously of the very famous Montego Bay Convention, in addition to the instruments and tools I've mentioned. I do recognize that the maritime institutional architecture is sometimes a bit complex. Yes, but the world is also complex and volatile. And as we all know, working in a multilateral environment, when we work in a multilateral environment, as we all do, pragmatism is the world and balance is probably the right method. So our main challenge here to improve ocean governance is being at the same time to have ambition and coherence. And this has to do with the 6 events, milestone events in 2022 that will contribute to an improved ocean governance. I will just mention them very briefly. One was the Unep 5, the United Nations Environmental Assembly, that took this decision about plastics. The second one, the BBNJ, the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biodiversity on Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, an important instrument that is being developed in New York to strengthen high sea governance. Number 3, COP15 of biodiversity in Kunming in China, where we'll address the question of protected areas, apart from other issues, obviously. The UNFCCC COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt, also taking place this year. The WTO Ministerial Conference in June, all colleagues in Geneva know that much better than me. And of course, the sixth milestone event is the United Nations Ocean Conference that will take place in Lisbon. So year after year, the ocean is becoming less healthy, more polluted, more acidic, with less oxygen, with more dead zones, warmer and less resilient. This is why it is so relevant for Portugal, which is why it's so relevant to my country to address these critical issues. And that's why we consider that maritime issues are indeed a pillar in our foreign policy. In the last decade, we have developed many tools, again, in terms of national ocean governance, and we are obviously willing to share with colleagues, and these Blue Talks are also an instrument to do that, as well as the United Nations Ocean Conference. We are willing to share with colleagues the many things that Portugal has done in the last decade, from the ocean satellite account to the maritime special planning law, which was approved by the Portuguese Parliament in 2015. So I know that time is short, I'll come to an end here, but really the coherence of all these plans, the need to make them consistent and operational, and at the same time the determination to give a step further, are really the guiding lines of the United Nations Ocean Conference that Portugal and Kenya will co-host in Lisbon in the last week of June, guided obviously by science and innovation. This is what we call the road to Lisbon, and we hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Duarte, for setting the scene, highlighting some of the challenges that we're facing in the oceans, but also some of the main governance framework that exist in this area and some of the milestones that are facing us. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Geneva Blue Talks session on new disciplines on fisheries subsidies to achieve SDG14 and improve oceans governance. My name is Christophe Bellman. I'm the head of policy analysis and strategy at TESS, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs. And it's my great pleasure to moderate our discussion today. As you've heard, this dialogue is part of this Blue Talk series, which are organized all around the world in the run-up to the UN Oceans Conference. Maybe before we start, a couple of words on the conference. It's the second edition of the conference. The first took place back in 2017. It will involve a wide range of actors from private sector, youth organizations, and a whole range of stakeholders. We'll try to coordinate the work of various international initiatives in the area of the seas. In terms of outcome, the main really outcome is that is expected is the adoption by consensus of a concise political declaration to support the implementation of SDG 14, hopefully a declaration that is action and solution oriented and based on science and innovation. The declaration is still under negotiation in New York, but we know that the latest draft already contains some reference on the need to end harmful subsidies. In addition to the political declaration, national and local governments, civil society, NGOs, academia, the scientific community, and the private sectors can and are expected to submit voluntary commitments towards the implementation of SDG 14. So much on the background for the UN Oceans Conference. On the topic that we're addressing today, it's really, as you know, at the heart of ongoing discussions in the WTO, and this issue of subsidies is probably the most concrete and immediate contribution that Geneva can do to the achievement of SDG 14. You've all heard the figure of $35 billion being provided every year in fisheries subsidies, out of which 22 billion are estimated to directly contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, with significant consequences not only on fish stocks, but also on livelihood and food security worldwide. As you know, efforts at crafting new international rules to end those harmful subsidies have been ongoing for more than 20 years now. and should be finally concluded by the next WTO Ministerial Conference in June this year. So as governments try to address the last kind of sticking points in these highly complex negotiations, I think the discussion today will really provide a good opportunity for us to understand why these talks are so critical, what are the key issues that still need to be resolved, and what can be done to support effective implementation if and when an agreement is reached. For this, we're very fortunate to have a set of highly knowledgeable speakers. In the interest of time, I will only briefly introduce them as I give the floor to them. If you're interested in knowing more about their bios, you'll find them on the event of the website of the event. In terms of structure, I think the idea for the discussion is to start with an overview of some of the environmental, social, and economic rationale for disciplining fisheries subsidies at the international level. We'll then dive really into the ongoing negotiations at the WTO, where we are, what can we expect. And finally, we'll discuss the role also of other governance processes in the UN system to address the issue. After the presentations, we'll take a few interventions from the floor. So as Diana mentioned, for those attending online, please write your question and comments directly in the chat box. So with this, let me immediately move to our discussion and turn to our first speaker, Bruno Polzi, Director of the Europe Office of the UN Environment Programme. All the speakers, please stick to your 7 minutes in the interest of time. You have the floor.
Merci, Christophe. Thanks a lot, and a real pleasure to be with the Geneva Environment Network again for this discussion. Colleagues, as you know, and friends, about 50 years ago, the world came together for the first UN conference on human development and human environment, and tried to make the connection between development on one side and the environment. And the hope and the creation of Unep that came from it is today materialized also by the fact that we are facing a triple planetary crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And these crises are really embedded in the ocean that we are discussing today. In a few weeks, 2 weeks actually, leaders of the world will meet in Stockholm once again to look at what we've achieved in 50 years, but also to look at bold and urgent action to tackle this triple planetary crisis. And I put this into perspective as we go into this conference in Lisbon, because we are addressing the same problem. Now, when it comes to the problem of overfishing and regulating fisheries subsidies, we actually have an opportunity for our leaders to follow through on the bold and urgent actions that is needed to address the three crises. Overfishing is, as you said, not only unsustainable in terms of development, but it is also, in fact, an environmental crisis which is affecting millions of people. 90% of the global marine fish stocks have been fully exploited or are overexploited, depleted through overfishing, improper management of resources in the ocean, and it threatens the lives and livelihoods of more than 820 million people. So we've got a real challenge. And we need to address it. And one of the options that we put on the table is to have an ecosystem approach to ocean management. By adopting this approach and coastal policy and management, we will have the prerequisite to ensure the long-term healthy and productive life of our oceans and coasts. In turn, ensuring that the livelihoods and the sustainable development of millions of coastal people and societies are ensured. The ecosystem-based ocean management involves, for example, the area-based management through instruments and tools like marine protected areas, marine spatial planning, and integrated coastal management. It involves taking an ecosystem service perspective that values and incorporate the natural capital in ocean planning and decision-making. It looks at ocean management across sectors and across economic priorities. And it addresses all human impacts on the ocean, meaning the combined negative effect of fisheries, overfishing, coastal development, pollution, and climate change. It would ensure an inclusive and consultative approach to marine management with the engagement of all relevant stakeholders in the planning and decision-making. And it would apply, and that's very important, a precautionary principle, which means that in absence of knowledge or scientific facts, you don't go into action, you apply the precaution. This is what we call also in the SDG target 14.2, that calls for adoption of ecosystems-based approaches to ocean and coastal management through marine conservation, protection, and restoration. And today the target is met partially through the adoption of national and regional protocols and action plans, but more efforts are needed to upscale the ecosystem-based management. And we can see a number of very good examples that are trying to do this, notably in the Mediterranean, which from Geneva is the closest sea that we have. Now, what is Unep doing in all of this? Well, we are working towards the achievement of SDG 14 by supporting member states to upscale ecosystem-based management on one side, but also to improve trade policies, including when it comes to fisheries subsidies. And we're looking at facilitating a transition towards a sustainable blue economy. Now, as I was saying on the first, we have an active role in assisting countries to adopt ecosystems-based approach to ocean management. And that includes normative policy guidance, planning and decision support tools, and capacity building at national and local level, including through the regional seas program that we manage. When it comes to fisheries subsidies, Unep, together with UNCTAD and FAO, and with support from member states, presented in 2019 an interagency plan of action that aims at accelerating the targets of SDG 14, notably by improving trade and trade-related policies that would safeguard food security, but also contribute to the conservation and the sustainable use of ocean, living marine resources and livelihoods. And that would include also a support to member states in the negotiations and implementation of trade reforms at the international level. We also actively engage in the transition towards sustainable blue economies through a wall of government approaches that includes facilitating sustainable fisheries. We've pilot testing, for example, a new sustainable blue economy transition framework, which would help countries navigate transition to sustainable, climate resilient, inclusive blue economies, tailored to their interest and their national settings. This framework would anchor the conceptual discussion in a more practical planning process and practical steps, providing entry points to identify core priorities and building an integrated policy framework. It could help to develop a strong environment that would include blue economy readiness assessment, identifying practical impact pathways, strategic interventions, and capacity needs. And finally, it would enable blue financing by working with the private sector, banks, insurers, investors, and we're doing this Unep and Unep Finance initiative together. We have developed guidance for them on how to avoid and mitigate risks and impacts on the environment, as well as highlighting opportunities that they have when they provide capital to companies or projects that do sustainable blue economy. So in conclusion, and I hope I've kept my 7 minutes nearly, the upcoming months are really crucial. We always say that, but that's really true when it comes to ocean governance. Before Lisbon, and we've heard the world will meet in a number of settings, including in Stockholm and in Geneva, and we need to act. So our hope is that with the plan that I've outlined, Unep will continue to support Kenya, Portugal, and all member states and stakeholders in the negotiations and in achieving SDG 14. Stopping overfishing, improving ocean management, and through this, addressing the challenges of the triple planetary crisis. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bruno, for this introductory remark and for highlighting this ecosystem approach, which I think is quite important in achieving SDG 14. Thanks also for mentioning the interagency plan of action with UNCTAD and FAO. Moving to our next speaker, we have Charlotte de Fontaubert, who is a global lead for the blue economy at the World Bank. Charlotte will be joining us virtually. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. I am going to try and share my screen to present a brief overview about what the World Bank is doing in this agenda. I apologize. I'm sorry I can't be in person in Geneva, but thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. Very timely event, and very happy to be able to represent the bank here. Let me just launch the first one, and can I just have a sound check that you can see the first slide of my show?
Yes, we can.
Perfect, thank you so much. Brilliant. The previous speaker has very well set the stage in terms of the importance of the issues that we are dealing with, and I would like to go briefly over some of the economic points that underline the need for this reform, as well as a brief overview of what the World Bank is trying to do in order to support this process. My name is Charlotte de Fontaubert. I'm the global lead for the blue economy, and I'm leading the bank's work on fisheries subsidies reform. So most of our work started with a series of reports called the Sunken Billions, where we tried to do an economic analysis of what numbers actually really say about the global fishing crisis and whether or not the situation is as bad as it is and where the problems lie. So based on interesting, innovative economic modeling, what we found is basically that the target ought to be a reduction in global fishing effort by 40%. But what was really, really interesting is that, again, based on this modeling, what we found is that by reducing the fishing effort by such a number, we achieve a number of win-win-wins. So first of all, and perhaps most importantly, what we found is if you do achieve this kind of reduction in fishing effort, the first thing that happens is that we know that biomass will increase basically from 215 to 580 million tons in the water. So that's basically the fish in the water. What would happen if we gave those stocks a bit of a break and we didn't overfish them? So according to FAO figures, it's been mentioned before, basically 30% of the stocks are overfished, which means that the more we fish them, the lower the level of the stock goes. If you look at it from an optimistic standpoint, you can say that about 60% are fished exactly where they should be, which is the MSY or MEY, but there is a degree of uncertainty. So again, what we showed was that basically you can have a higher sustainable harvest level by fishing much less. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but bear with me. What we showed is you can catch more by fishing less. Related to these issues, and perhaps more importantly in terms of what does this mean at the end of the day, we also showed that basically the lending prices are also going to increase by more than 25%, or would increase by more than 24%. Why? Because basically you're going to have healthier stocks, you're going to have larger fish, and then those larger fish are going to fetch higher prices. From an economic standpoint, then this becomes really interesting. So we start with the biological, we go to the economic, and then of course you can deduct sort of social and poverty aspects, which are the ones that the World Bank focuses on. So we also showed that we tried to put everything in hard cash numbers, because these are the ones that tend to grab attention of policymakers. And again, here what we showed is that basically you can expect an almost 30-fold increase in the net benefits that would be derived from sustainably global managed fisheries. So this is what we call the sunken billions. And when we did the comparison to 2012, which is when we had the latest updated information, we had a global benefits of $3 billion a year, and our estimates showed that these revenues could increase to almost 90 billion. So just in terms of, there might be some variation from one year to the next, and you expect basically in excess of 80 billion every year. That's basically foregone. These are foregone benefits. This is money that's just wasted because of overfishing. And this would be because A, the fishing costs would be higher, would be lower, and B, the fishing harvest would be higher. So basically, our findings really called a obvious question, which is how much of this is driven by fishery subsidies. So we all know the figures, about 35 to 40 billion dollars a year in subsidies, depends on how you measure them. And then from that standpoint, we started thinking, how can we quantify the importance of the subsidies to the crisis situation, and what can we do about it? At the end of the day, the World Bank is focused on what we can do for our client countries and how we can help them manage their fisheries more sustainably. So we recognized fishery subsidies as basically a distorting phenomenon. And that led us to think, how then can we redress this distortion? I would add that we are working right now on a new modeling project. We're trying to quantify what would happen with and without subsidies in 3 major fisheries in Mauritania, South China Sea, and East China Sea. And we have preliminary findings, which will be presented in Lisbon. So definitely watch that space. Important to notice that what we are saying, we're not saying that the governments need to disengage from investing in the sector, but rather they need to redirect the support along a more productive path. So we're not doubting the intentions of the governments as they support their fisheries, but we're trying to say that basically there are unintended consequences that, if addressed, could play a really key role in fixing the situation. So concretely, what we're trying to do, we are keeping our modeling, we keep going on our modeling, but we've also identified a key avenue of intervention, which is one of public expenditure reviews. What's striking when you look at subsidies is that basically governments themselves don't necessarily know the extent to which they are subsidizing. So through PERs, which you've adapted to the fishery situation, we're giving the governments a new tool to assess accurately how they can understand better the effects of their policies, which again are taken probably with the best of intentions, but again, beware of the unintended consequences. So what we would like to emphasize is the need to use government support to help cover the cost of the necessary reforms. We know that the level of fishing effort needs to be reduced, but we also know that this is going to be socially painful. So we would like to help governments identify ways to support this transition. A clear, simple way of thinking about it is there are too many boats catching too few fish, so some of these boats are going to have to be decommissioned. What then is going to happen to the fishermen who make a living on these boats? So that would be one of the aspects. And we also want to divert the attention to measures that we know will strengthen fishery sustainability. So we're talking about, MPAs, stock assessment, scientific research. There are so many things that governments can do in order to enable this transition. So that's what we're focused on. I know that my time is up, so I'm going to relinquish the floor at this point, but just to, in final words, to re-emphasize the commitment to the World Bank to working with partners like the ones who are involved today to help in this incredibly important but challenging issue that we need to tackle. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Charlotte. That was really good, and thanks for sharing some of the findings from the world of the work of the World Bank, reminding us of this maybe counterintuitive fact that actually fishing less might allow us to catch more fish, and also for highlighting the need to repurpose and redirect some of the support in the sector. So much for the the general background. We now focus on what is happening more specifically at the World Trade Organizations. And we're very fortunate to have Alistair McFarlane, who is the International Fisheries Management expert at the Ministry for Primary Industries in New Zealand, who will give us an update on where we are and what to be expected by the next ministerial. You have the floor.
Thank you, Christoph. At first, I need to say that I'm a latecomer to this discussion today, because the person who should be in front of you is the Ambassador Santiago Wills, who is the chair of the negotiation, but he's been called away to Davos with bigger things. And I'm grateful for the history that we've just had from the World Bank, because it's important to recall that the subsidies negotiation has been on the agenda of the World Trade Organization since 2020. Since 2000, sorry, and we are now 22 years later. It was actually first brought to the attention of WTO members in the newly formed organization in the 1990s. So this is not a new issue. The mandate for the negotiations as they are currently comes from the previous World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference number 11, which was in 2017, 5 years ago. And the UN Sustainable Development Goal Target 14.6. And it's worth repeating the language of Target 14.6, which is by 2020, for 2 years into injury time, prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the World Trade Organization's fisheries subsidies negotiation. So all of those issues are alive in the negotiation. And with the deadline of the Ministerial Conference now less than 3 weeks away, the fisheries subsidies agreement negotiations are at an intense stage. The chair of the subsidies negotiation, Ambassador Wills of Colombia, convened a week of intensive negotiations from 16 to 20 May last week. Some 50 delegations took part, mostly in person, and a number of capital-based officials travelled to Geneva for the week. I'm one of them. At the end of last week, Ambassador Wills was quoted in a media release from the WTO as follows. We can't have Ambassador Wills, we'll have his words. Members have adopted a positive tone and shown some new flexibility in the discussions, paving the way for decisions to be made to close the remaining gaps ahead of the 12th Ministerial Conference next month. Overall, I sensed a positive vibe during this week's meetings and noticed members' willingness to constructively engage in discussions. I was also encouraged to see some movement in positions, and he added that all members further expressed a desire for an effective and ambitious outcome. Now, the chair reported that much of the work over that week of meetings was in different configurations, focused on some of the outstanding issues in the draft agreement that need to be resolved, such as the treatment of non-specific fuel subsidies, the balance and ambition related to overcapacity and overfishing, including special and differential treatment for developing country members and least developed country members, the issue of reflagging of fishing vessels to flags of different members or other jurisdictions, transparency requirements related to forced labour, and territoriality. And he went on to say, however, we are not done yet, and it is clear that to reach an agreement before MC12, we must get this done not later than the week of the 30th of May, which ends not on the 30th of May, but on the 3rd of June, which I see as Fish Decision Week, and added that he had heard some members say that it is now or never for a fish agreement. So here we are. We need to do everything we can to ensure the agreement is now. And so what are the prospects for MC11? The prospects for an agreement are better. MC12, sorry. And it says 12 on the piece of paper in front of me. The prospects for an agreement at MC12 are better than they've ever been. But that optimism has to be severely caveated. It is by no means a foregone conclusion. We are currently working with a text that would have gone to ministers in November. The work we are doing now is aimed at making it more consensual and to reduce the number of points for ministerial decision to a very small number before they must decide to adopt or reject. So at the concluding session on Friday, Ambassador Wills noted that there needed to be a significant increase in engagement among members to find common ground when we come back to the 30th of May. The work of the previous Fish Week was focused on technical points. The work of Fish Decision Week will require looking horizontally across the text to ensure coherence and balance. The whole text is in square brackets, of course, for ministers to make final decisions. Members are being challenged to find the common ground that will enable as many of the internal square brackets as possible to be removed and present ministers with a clean text. And so it is reasonable to anticipate that there will be a revision released in the week of 6th of June. And for those who wish to look at the current text, it's references WT/MIN in brackets 21/W5. And it's a public document available on the WTO's website. So the next steps, well, let's assume next week we have an agreement, next month rather, we have an agreement. And what happens next? Well, the first thing that happens is that lawyers get a hold of the document and they scrub it. They work with the text and they turn it into legal language, and hopefully they don't destroy the interpretations that members have come to. The text is then open for members, and that may take some time before the agreement enters into force. And by some time, that's probably a period of 2 to 3 years. Because you have to recall that members will require to make regulatory and legislative changes in order to be able to meet the requirements of the agreement. And it is best practice not to adhere to an agreement before you have the capacity to deliver it. The operational processes for the agreement have to be established. It won't be an addendum to the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement. It is a separate agreement with its own character, and it will require the establishment of its own meeting processes, including its own committee elected by members. And finally, the agreement has a review clause where the committee will be required to review the operation of the agreement not later than 5 years from entry into force. And that's where we are.
Thanks a lot. And thank you also for sticking to your time. I think that was a fantastic overview of where we are in the negotiating process. We'll now move to Alice Tipping, who's the lead on fisheries subsidies at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IASD, who will give us a sense of what are still the sticking points, I was going to say, and maybe what are the key decisions that still need to be taken to conclude the agreement. Alice, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you very much indeed, Christoph. And thank you to the Geneva Environment Network and also to the permanent missions of Kenya and Portugal very much for putting this all together. It's clear that as one of the key targets under SDG14, these particular negotiations, at least in my mind, are a key input to the UN Ocean Conference later on in June. So we're all working as hard as we can, losing our voice, some of us, in order to ensure that the negotiations can move ahead and can reach a successful outcome at MC12. So I'll talk maybe kind of drawing on what Alistair's just said about what's on the table in the text before members, and Alistair has helpfully given you the document reference number. So I'll talk a little bit about what's on the table in that text and what some of the key decisions are that remain to be taken, some of the key gaps that members need to close. So you might remember we were talking at the beginning, in fact I think it was Bruno who was talking about SDG 14.6. So that target under SDG 14 specifically points to, I think, kind of two key elements that have become part of the WTO negotiations. The first is the idea of eliminating subsidies that go to illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing. And the second is this idea of, drawn from the WTO ministerial mandate from 2001, of prohibiting those subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and to overfishing. And Charlotte's presentation, I think, was a really interesting reminder of the costs of overfishing. So when fleets are too large, they catch too many fish, that ends up depleting the stock. It makes the ecosystems, marine ecosystems, more fragile, but it also makes the sector more fragile, right? Fishermen struggle to make a living and they become more dependent on subsidies. So those are the two elements in SDG 14, and not surprisingly, those are two of the key elements in the text on the table. So there are essentially three main substantive rules that the members are talking about. The first is a rule that would prohibit subsidies from being given to vessels that are the subject of an IUU determination. So when a government, a coastal state, or a regional management organization makes a determination that a vessel has engaged in IUU fishing, governments would be prohibited from subsidizing that vessel for a period of time. And interestingly, in the text, it's the member subsidizing that decides how long that period of time is. So there's interesting balances all the way through. So that's one thing, a prohibition on subsidies to vessels found engaged in IUU fishing. The second main rule is a prohibition of subsidies to stocks that are already overfished. So where too many fish have already been taken out and the biomass, as Charlotte was referring to, the biomass is already depleted. So those subsidies are prohibited unless you have management measures in place to help rebuild that stock. So again, an element of balance. So those are the first two main substantive pillars, main rules. And my assessment, and I'd be interested to hear if Alistair disagrees, but my assessment is that those two rules in the text are basically stable, right? There are very carefully crafted balances and compromises in those two articles in the text. So at least my expectation is that they won't be reopened. Those are now stable. The other two really interesting pieces of substantive rules in the text is in an article that's dedicated, going back to the SDG target 14.6, dedicated to the idea of prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and contribute to overfishing. So how have they chosen to do that? What they've ended up with is essentially a list of the kinds of subsidies that are most likely to contribute to overfishing, most likely to contribute to overcapacity. And that's things like subsidies to fuel. The cheaper your fuel is, I mean, fishing is an extremely fuel intensive activity. The cheaper your fuel is, the more you can fish. The longer you can fish, the farther away you can fish. So fuel, for example, is one of the subsidies on that list. So members agree not to provide those subsidies unless, and again, the element of balance, unless they have management measures in place to keep the stocks fished at a sustainable level. So that's the sort of the main prohibition. There are a couple of other additional interesting rules, two of which really focus on subsidies to fishing outside a member's national waters, right? So there's a sense that subsidies that are designed to push fleets out into the high seas or push fleets out into another country's waters are very likely to contribute to overcapacity and contribute to overfishing. So there are two ideas there. There's an interesting idea on the table Alistair referred to, which was discussed a lot last week, of prohibiting subsidies that vessels that don't carry the flag of the government that's subsidizing them, right? Again, so there are a number of different kinds of rules in this last article designed to try and capture aspects of the problem. So that's essentially what members have ended up with in terms of the prohibitions or the rules that are designed to capture this idea of subsidies contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So that's the rules, the prohibitions side of the equation. But the really interesting element, and where this question of balance that Alistair was referring to comes in, is that there's a very important part of that article that refers to special and differential treatment for developing country members. And this, again, it's explicitly referred to in SDG 14.6, and it's a fundamental part of the balance of rights and obligations in this treaty, and it's still, I'd say, unresolved in this last article on overcapacity and overfishing. So in the special and differential treatment paragraph, there are a number of different exceptions, quite interestingly tailored to the specific question of fishing and the specific question of fisheries subsidies. So there's a permanent exception for essentially artisanal fishing within 12 nautical miles, so quite a restricted geographical scope. And that's the balance as it is, but there's some uncertainty over whether that geographical limit will stick. There's a specific exception for those WTO members that catch very little, that catch less than, say, 0.7% of global catch. So it's what's being referred to as a de minimis exception. So there's those two things. And then there's for those members that aren't very small players in the global fishing space, they would have a transition period for the subsidies for their commercial fishing. So they would also have access to the artisanal exception, but for those subsidies that they provide to their non-artisanal, to their more commercial scale fishing, they would have a transition period of X number of years. And that is one of the main sticking points, is exactly how long that transition period might be. Some members favour something in the single digits, between 5 to 7 years. Some others strongly favour a much longer transition period. So this is, again, one of the key decisions members are going to have to make, is are they comfortable with the balance between the list of subsidies that are prohibited and the prohibitions on subsidies and the exceptions provided for developing members? Does everybody feel that the rules and the exceptions and the whole package within that article accurately establish enough discipline that we feel we're really meeting our mandate, both within the WTO system and with respect to SDG 14.6, but we've also provided appropriate and effective flexibilities for developing countries, many of whom feel that the subsidies that they provide to their fishing industry will be extremely difficult to reform, and they require some flexibility, perhaps in time, or perhaps in actual substance of the rules, in order to make that transition politically feasible, to be very frank. So I think that's one of the key questions there. Is the special and differential treatment and the balance appropriate? And I think one of the other sort of very interesting key decisions still to be made is exactly how we design some of these additional prohibitions, right? So, by the additional prohibitions, I'm talking about those that focus on subsidies that are designed to push vessels into the high seas or into other members' exclusive economic zones, because those, I think, are politically important for many members, but are also already part of the overall structure of an extremely global industry. So there's some interesting indications of possible landing zones on some of those issues, but I think those, at least if I was to narrow it down to two, are some of the key decisions that I hope can be made in Fish Decision Week, which is next week. So I'll leave it that, happy to come back to questions. Thanks, Christoph.
Thanks a lot, Alice, for giving us a sense of the very high complexity of those negotiations and some of the issues that still need to be addressed. Moving on, we'll now have Rémi Parmentier, who's the founder and director of the Varda Group and advisor to Friends of Ocean Action. Will give us, I hope, more of a kind of civil society on this perspective on these negotiations. Rémi.
Thank you, Christophe, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Unep, for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to say a few words on behalf of Friends of Ocean Action, which is a coalition of outstanding ocean advocates, which is co-chaired the group by Isabella Lövin, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, and Ambassador Peter Thompson, the Special Envoy of the UN Secretary General for the Ocean, who will be next week at your next Blue Geneva session. Friends of Ocean Action is a member of the Stop Funding Overfishing Coalition, which is made up of some 85 NGOs. You can check it on stopfundingoverfishing.com. And on behalf of that group, I would like to say that we very much support the proposal tabled by Ambassador Santiago Wills from Colombia, who's chairing the negotiations on fisheries subsidies at the WTO. As Alice has outlined, and Alistair as well to some extent, the proposal is not perfect. But we think that it is time to move on. We've been waiting for more than 20 years. I was at the third Ministerial Conference of the WTO in Seattle in 1999, and we were already discussing the need to prohibit harmful fisheries subsidies. And if you look at the text in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goal 14.6, which has been mentioned by several previous speakers, the target is or was 2020. And the reason why it was 2020 and not 2030, like the vast majority of SDG targets, is because this is really important, really urgent. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that prohibiting harmful fisheries subsidies is the most single important step that can be taken now by the international community to protect marine biodiversity. There is no question about it. And now is the time. And I would tell WTO members that they've run out of excuses. There is no pandemic, or no pandemic that prevents holding a meeting in just 2 or 3 weeks. There is the issue has been discussed time and time again ad nauseum, and it's time to move on. And of course, the proposal which reflects a possible consensus is not perfect, but as you know, sometimes perfection is the enemy of the good, and we go with the good. All right, so let's move on. Let's adopt this this proposal now. And a mention has been made to entry into force by Alistair in particular, entry into force of the agreement. But as you know, once the agreement is adopted, countries have the obligation to move on. You don't have to wait for the entry into force of the agreement to start implementing it. So now is the time. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the WTO, and I think also Ambassador Santiago Wills will both come to Lisbon to the UN Ocean Conference, which will take place 2 weeks after the Ministerial Conference of the WTO. And it would be an embarrassment if they came to say that once again, the WTO has been unable to reach a consensus. We're talking of discipline, right? Well, let's have discipline with the timetable. We understand why it was not possible to adopt the agreement in 2020 as per the target in SDG 14.6. That was a pandemic. But as I said, everybody's run out of excuses now, and now is the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Remy. And I think, yeah, it's important. Now is the time, as you mentioned. So thanks for sharing this perspective. Let's now move on maybe a little bit beyond the WTO itself and ask David Vivas from UNCTAD. David is a legal officer at the Trade, Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development branch to give us his perspective. David is joining us from the Caribbean. So thanks for waking up early in the morning. You have the floor.
Thank you, Christophe. I have some slides if they can be shared. I had a segment on recent findings on economic analysis of the OECD data on fish subsidies to strengthen all the arguments that have been made today. I will then go and set some links with some important current processes ongoing in the UN, and then conclude with some recommendations already made at the UN Oceans Forum in Geneva, trying to help in the consensus building process with no more excuses, as Remy has just said. Next slide, please. Here, you see, I'm not using Dr. Somalia's data. I'm using the OECD data for two reasons. First, these are based on real notifications by member states, so they can be held accountable to. Second, this data, it's gathered per year. There is a 4-year gap. So the maximum data, the most close data we have is 2018, but you can see the series of the year, which is very important to understand the political influence of the process on what countries do in relation to funding their fisheries sector with public resources. If you see to the left, or my left will be your right, the global fisheries to most estimate, we can see that from 2010 to 2014, the notified subsidies were about 12 billion, and they started to come down. Many say that this was a consequence of advancements in WTO negotiations, the SDG14 mandate, EU reforms that were happening, Chinese reforms to some extent, and the amount of subsidies were coming down significantly, almost to 9. So it went down almost 3 billion in notified data. Now, since 2016, the amount of subsidies are coming up again. And this is a very worrisome trend. And that's why we need a WTO subsidies agreement now. And this is with a 4-year data gap. If I would try to do let's put it this way, an estimate of what will be the amounts today and what will be the trend will continue to go up probably to more than 12 billion. Why? Because we had the COVID. There have been significant amount of resources being given to the fishery sector, not to increase fishing in this period, but to sustain income by fishers that were not fishing during the confinement period. After that, we start to have high prices in fuels, so the amount or the support for fuel subsidies may be also important. So we may be in front of an upward trend in many countries, and we're not realizing that if we don't regulate this now, it's going to be difficult to control in the near future. Now, the second image figure shows who are the main subsidizers. Obviously, China #1 based on their own reporting national level. But we also have a similar level of about 1 billion, a little bit more by Japan, United States, and the EU. In the case of the EU, I think this is an underestimate because many EU members have not notified to the OECD, so it could be similar to Japan or a little bit higher. But you can also start looking at the role of some developing countries. Look at Brazil, close to the EU. You have, well, Korea is not a developing country anymore, but you can see that OECD countries are still subsidizing to a significant level, even countries that are demanders of phasing them out. Now, it's important to know that these are volumes. These are not harmful fish subsidies. This is fishery support to the entire sector, good and bad. And I will show the disaggregation later. Next slide, please. Now, if we try to compare that data, we did and try to analyze this against two factors, exports and share of work catch. And as you can see in the chart, the dark blue are the subsidies, the light blue is the trade, and the little dots is the share of work catch. Countries subsidize for different reasons. There are countries where the subsidies have a stronger link with trade, more than with catch, typical case of Norway, EU, the US. But you have countries where the link is stronger with the catch and internal demand. That can be seen in China, in Japan, and a little bit into the EU. So there may be different reasons for the subsidiation. One is having the resources for processing, exporting, etc. Others for supplying the internal demand, plus also some reprocessing and trading, but being the most important consideration, the need to feed their own population. And these are important to understand the psyche of the negotiators. Next one, please. Like we have 7 minutes, it's yes. Now, well, there have been many typologies of classification of how to do subsidies. The most common one is the one on capacity enhancing, neutral, and sustainable purposes. If you see the data of the OECD in 2016-18, here the average is 9.4 million, again going up after, but you can see how big is the amount of subsidies or public support to fuel. One of the ones that have been considered most harmful. You see also a significant amount given to vessels and gears, and these are OECD countries that have, many of them already introduced some level of reform. So there is a lot to do to try to phase out, and mentioned by the World Bank lady, to shift the subsidies to more sustainable areas. There are others that are neutral or have social purposes like income or infrastructure, but we have to see that they are still, even with the notifications by the countries themselves, that they could be, not everything should be as transparent as we may think, that there is a need for reform, significant need for reform now. Next, please. I won't talk a lot about the negotiations because it was mentioned today, but I will make at least some comments before I go into the other processes. The first is that I think the three-pillar provisions, as mentioned by Alice, has been balanced with flexibilities. There are flexibilities that are not only applicable to developing countries, flexibilities applicable to all countries, especially on restoration of stocks and managing sustainability. I think special and differential treatment should not be only seen as an escape clause or an exception. It has to be as elements to enable countries to be able to comply and apply the provisions in the near future. And many countries have, and I've been listening to this all the time, are very concerned about the article on transparency and notifications, because a lot of the data there simply do not exist today. And I can confirm that on the ground. Looking at different agencies, etc. So huge efforts will be needed. Now, linking it to other international processes, a WTO fish subsidies agreement is essential now due to the length and the importance of tackling overfishing. If we will wait for Sofia 2022, but it's not going to look better. It may look worse in the amount of fishers. I already have some of the data, and it's not pretty. So we need this agreement now. And this agreement this year will be the most important outcome for oceans governments in 2022, if we're able to reach it. So as there are difficulties, there are also incentives for member states to really say, we can do something, let's do it now. So there also will be political benefits if members really move this year. Now, there are other processes that we need to start looking at. That's why we need this to be closed soon. One important one is on negotiations on marine biodiversity in areas with national jurisdiction, which includes several issues. One is the issue of marine genetic resources. The other is area-based management, including marine protected areas, transfer of technology, and also impact assessments on activities in the high seas. Now, at glance, people say, no, there is no link with fisheries, but I would say there is very clearly in at least several areas. On marine genetic resources, because restoration of stocks, activities to replenish the oceans may need genetic resources for activities such as sea ranching and nurseries. Genetic resources are going to become fundamental for aquaculture. The amount of patents is multiplying from almost zero in 2000 to more than 10,000 per year in the year 2015. So it's going really fast. And that's going to affect many of the activities for conservation. The second point in area-based management is that marine protected areas will define, and many of the conservation areas in this management process that is trying to clarify these different type of regulatory conservation areas is going to define what's legal or illegal in many areas, and that's a key element to one of the provisions. There are also the negotiations on transfer of technology that will be important to facilitate the process for more sustainable management of fisheries. Then we have the FAO guidance on social sustainability, a lot of emphasis on the environmental, but we also have fishers and livelihoods to take care. And we have an international instrument to address plastic pollution. Most of the plastic pollution that we know is it's land-based and land originated, but we need to take care of this piece to ensure we have a result. So now, I won't go to the conclusion of negotiations. Like, we're already at praying mode You know, it's getting to a level of desperation. Let's hope things happen in the next month. But we have two milestones important this year, of importance this year. The first is that the UN Oceans Conference. It's interesting to know that the initial draft of the political declaration, fish subsidies of 14.6 was not mentioned. Trade was not mentioned. Maritime transport was not mentioned. Many of the sustainable economic sectors were not mentioned. So we did a big push together, UNTAC, FAO, Unep, together with DESA to try to assist nations in New York so they could include these elements in the political declaration. They are there, very soft, but they are there. There is also there will be an interactive dialogue on management fisheries, which include Target 4 and 6. And a concept note was produced by FAO and UNTAC in coordination with many stakeholders, where all the issues on fish subsidies are well developed together with WTO to explain members which are the possibilities and the actions to be taken, and hoping for an agreement. That has not yet been published. Only concept notes from 5 to 7 have been published. 1 to 4 have not been published. I imagine there is some level of controversy in all of them, and they are being discussed and will be published soon from New York. The interactive dialogue may give recommendations, but importantly, this is going to happen just 15 days after the WTO ministerial. So if things go well, we will all celebrate and discuss about implementation. If things do not go so well, people will start discussing then what's next. Perhaps an extension in WTO will be agreed. If not, how we retake or implement SDG 14.6 if there are problems in WTO, because the ball will come back to the UN side. And this has a separate process. And this is what people need to be aware. The Oceans Conference may give advice and recommendations, but it's not a decision-making body on monitoring of SDGs. It's going to be the 2022 high-level political forum. And that's in 5 to the 15th of July. And this year, we have SDG 14. Again, there is a sequencing one after the other, like a domino effect. If positive, then calls for implementation, because you can put everything on paper, but we need to move to the next phase. And we are happy to help all the agencies present, happy to work with all of them, wonderful research and pieces. But the implementation is going to be challenging. I'm going to be working a lot on the ground. And the reality, many fisheries agencies and a lot of management is not a pretty one. There is a lot of efforts to be done. It's also, so the reality is harsh. Finally, then, if we go into a less positive scenario, whether extension or the process is put on hold or whatever it is, big question for the high-level political forum. They will be the monitoring reports from FAO on the indicators that are not exactly related to WTO negotiations and the core of SDG 14.6. They are more related to instruments on IUU fishing, but there will be something to be done if nothing happens in WTO, and that may go to the General Assembly. So we don't know what will be the reaction, but they would be a need to make recommendations of what to do next. Hopefully, the more positive scenario that we all want. If it's not such a positive scenario, then what will be the role to the UN to implement SDG 14 if we find difficulties within the multilateral trade system that also include UNTAC? So we'll see. We're ready to help. We are involved in this process and happy to channel any input requests in these processes so they are successful. A final slide, please. These are just the recommendations of that done at the UN Oceans Forums in Geneva, trying to gather input from Geneva again for these two processes. And the number one recommendation is please adopt and sign a WTO agreement. Second, very important concern about we need to start identifying where are the policy, technical, legal gaps and changes that will be needed. ISD has been done a wonderful job there, Alice and team, but the implementation is going to be a very challenging phase. The realities are going to be very difficult. Again, the reason is very simple. We don't have experience and regulation on this anywhere in the world, not even developed countries. So this is going to be a challenge for many. So it's going to be a new full treaty for everybody. And again, we need to invest a lot in data collection, analytical tools. The science base is weak. The capacity of fisheries agencies is weak. They're underfunded. Licenses fees do not help to cover this. So we have a big challenge to be able to do all the notification and transparency we would like to do. And then we will need technical assistance, so we're ready to help. And again, thank you for all the present. And again, let's hope we have something to celebrate in the next month. Thank you.
Rachel Gogan, legal consultant at the CITES
Fellow panelists,
Secretariat.
colleagues, I'll give a quick overview of what CITES is and does before I elaborate on the important contribution that CITES makes to addressing the challenges brought about by harmful subsidies, focusing on those which Alice mentioned of IUU fishing and overexploitation, and our contribution to implementing SDG14. Thank you. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, or CITES, is a multilateral legally binding agreement with 184 parties, which was signed on the 3rd of March 1973, and we now celebrate the 3rd of March as World Wildlife Day every year. The Convention regulates trade in specimens of over 38,000 species of animals and plants. Now, many people associate CITES with elephants, tigers, and rhinos, but it actually covers an increasing number of commercially exploited fish and other marine species, as well as species which are unfortunately often bycatch of commercial fishing. Species that are covered include cetaceans, clams, corals, seahorses, and in recent years, more and more focus has been on sharks and rays. CITES is a dynamic instrument, and the structure of the treaty includes 3 appendices, setting out listed species according to how threatened they are by international trade. When it's proposed that a new marine species should be brought into the scope of the treaty, the proposal must first be assessed against agreed scientific criteria, with technical advice provided by an FAO expert panel, so that we can ensure traditional fisheries management and other perspectives are considered before a decision is made at the CITES Conference of the Parties. The CITES regime and the fisheries sector interact whenever there's an international trade transaction involving a CITES-listed aquatic species. And it's worth noting that CITES regulates trade in specimens from areas beyond national jurisdiction as well as between states, and that's covered by introduction from the sea, one of the categories, the 4 categories of trade under CITES. My fellow panelists have made reference to the challenges that are linked to harmful subsidies, such as overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. The negotiators, as we know, are working hard to find a solution to these challenges, and at CITES we are also working to address them, where they impact on listed species. And it's very valuable and timely to have this opportunity to come together to reflect on the complementarity of these processes in the lead up to the Oceans Conference in Lisbon. Looking first at IUU fishing, and I'm going to focus on CITES Appendix 2 species. You can see the categorization on the slide. Appendix 2 species are allowed to be commercially traded generally, as long as the trade is legal, sustainable, and reported. For the export of CITES specimens, the exporting country needs to be satisfied that a specimen was not obtained in contravention of the laws of that state or of any relevant regional fisheries management organisation, namely that the trade is legal. The trade must not be detrimental to the survival of the species in the wild, namely it must be sustainable. And this involves a science-based non-detriment finding. The trade must be reported to the CITES Secretariat, who make the information publicly available through the CITES Trade Database, so it's reported. Transit and importing states need to satisfy themselves of the necessary permits and cannot import a CITES specimen unless it is accompanied by the required permits. So the Convention really imposes obligations across the fisheries supply chain for listed species, involving source, transit, and destination states. We would therefore say CITES trade is the antithesis of IUU. CITES compliant trade is LRR, legal, reported, and regulated. CITES is also intrinsically impacted by the challenge of overexploitation, which can occur as a result of certain subsidies. Overexploitation may create a situation where the overexploited species begins to meet CITES scientific criteria for listing, so that if proposed and agreed by the Conference of the Parties, the species could end up being brought under CITES trade controls. Furthermore, where a species is already listed in Appendix 2, and CITES rules, as mentioned, require a non-detriment finding before specimens can be traded, then overexploitation, especially where most of the trade is not reported, makes it very difficult for national authorities to produce that non-detriment finding to evidence that wild stocks can be sustainably harvested. And this can be due to the lack of reporting muddying the waters on the actual take level, or simply due to evidence of overuse. Overexploitation can ultimately lead to trade suspensions under the CITES regime via our review of significant trade process, or indeed through other CITES compliance measures. So CITES works to combat the results of certain subsidies, even though we don't regulate the subsidies themselves. And it's clear that CITES rules and processes will continue to operate in a complementary fashion to new disciplines that are being negotiated, contributing to the shared goals of conservation and sustainable use of aquatic species. Now, there are, of course, implementation challenges faced by exporting countries in meeting the CITES requirements that I've described for trading commercially exploited aquatic species. The Secretariat is deeply engaged in capacity building to assist parties, in particular developing countries, to overcome these challenges and to facilitate sustainable ocean-based economies. For example, on Queen Conch, in certain Caribbean island states, we are working to support parties to take the right steps to lift applicable trade suspensions, working in partnership with UNCTAD and OECS. Through our national legislation project, we support drafting of legislation that meets CITES requirements. Through joint working with important partners such as UNCTAD and FAO, we contribute to implementing science-based management plans to rebuild overfished fish stocks to sustainable levels. We're currently delivering a series of workshops jointly with FAO to promote cooperation between CITES and fisheries authorities within parties' domestic administrations to increase understanding of the regime, why it's relevant, and how it should be implemented in the fisheries sector. The next round of workshops is again with Caribbean states at the end of this month. CITES parties have also adopted a number of resolutions on livelihoods and engaging with rural communities, and the Secretariat ensures this vital aspect is factored into our capacity building activities. For example, on training local farmers to local fisheries communities to use more sustainable net types that reduce bycatch in their fishing practices. So to sum up, CITES plays a rather specialised role in working towards fulfilling SDG14. And we certainly have shared goals with the discussions taking place at the WTO, and our discussions will continue at our 19th Conference of the Parties in Panama this year in November. The challenges around a lack of reporting and overexploitation, often linked to harmful subsidies, are familiar to us, and we know the importance of partnership in this space, whether it's with UNCTAD, FAO, WTO or others, who we will meet again in Lisbon. And we wish the WTO negotiators every success in Fish Decision Week. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel, for your intervention and for giving us the CITES perspective. That takes us to the end of our presentations. I will now open the floor for questions, comments. I will maybe check if someone in the room wants to raise a question. We also have questions from the chat. So while people are gathering their thoughts, let me maybe read one of the questions that we're getting. It's a question to all the panelists, so whoever wants to address it. What can we say about subsidies to small-scale artisanal fishing versus subsidies to industrial fishing? And I would add maybe, how is it reflected also in the disciplines? I see Remy, please go ahead.
Well, that's a very good question. It is estimated that about 80%, I mean, the figures vary sometimes, that on average 80% of all fisheries subsidies go to the big guys, to the detriment of the small guys. And if you look at SDG 14, one of the means of implementation is improving access to resources and to markets for the small-scale fishers. So unless you eliminate the harmful fisheries subsidies, you're not going to increase the access of small-scale fishers to markets and to resources. So it's an issue of social justice as well as a typical environmental issue. And let me say, as I have the floor, that this issue of eliminating harmful fishery subsidies is very important in the overall context of the SDGs, of the Sustainable Development Goals, because here you have approximately 22 billion of US dollars per year, which are used to do the opposite of what the majority of the SDG 14 targets tell governments to do. And this $22 billion would be much better used in what we call positive subsidies, for example, for monitoring, control, scientific research, designation and management of marine protected areas, and so forth. So this is really an existential crisis, not just for the WTO, but for sustainable development as a whole.
Thanks a lot, Remy, for this point. I'm just checking if there are any other questions or requests from the floor. I don't see anyone. So in the interest of time, what I'll do as we're reaching the end of the session is maybe give all the panelists a 10 seconds opportunity, a couple of sentences. What are your key takeaways from this discussion, but also what do you expect, assuming that there's an agreement in June, what do you expect from the UN Oceans Conference and as we move towards Lisbon? And I'll start in the same in the reverse order with Rachel.
Thank you. Looking towards the Lisbon conference, we are certainly looking forward to the opportunity to have more discussions like this, where we can focus on the complementarity between the various processes that are going on. And we are hoping to have our own side event there, TBC. So I hope to see you there. It'll be on promoting implementation of CITES towards sustainable and traceable ocean trade. So thank you.
Thanks. David?
Thank you, Christopher. My key message will be for member states, please do not be afraid. A WTO subsidies agreement will be good for all. Positive subsidies for sustainability can still be done. So you can sustain the livelihood, sustain the reestablishment and replenishment of the ocean. So there are many things that can be done. And for the small scale fishers, they need help to become more sustainable due to problems of a small scale. So let's hope the UN Oceans Conference can make a deep call for implementation of a WTO agreement as soon as it is agreed. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Remy?
Well, I would hope that WTO members do not want to look like the emperor wearing no clothes. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice?
Thank you. I mean, I have to agree, it really does feel like it's now or never on this agreement. And this is the phrase that members have used. But I'll add to that and say even more bluntly, I cannot imagine a situation where we would have another opportunity to get this done. I just cannot. I cannot imagine a confluence of political interest, UN interest, member states, proximity on the actual issues. I cannot in my mind envisage how we could ever get this close again. So it is now or never.
Seems to be consensus. Alistair?
Well, I have to echo everything that both Alice and Remy have said. It is now or never. I suppose some of the attention at the conference can also go towards the question of implementation and capacity building. And I know that the Director General has an initiative within the text for coordinating a fund for assisting members to address their challenges, particularly developing country members, obviously. And so while on the one hand we have the possibility of an option for not participating in this agreement for the smaller producers, that is really something that with capacity building should not be encouraged, and that we should hope to have as many members as possible parties to this agreement.
Thanks a lot. Charlotte?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. You couldn't have teed it better for me, what I wanted to say, which is obviously I'm in complete agreement with what everybody else has said about the need for this reform to happen. We're very, very conscious that it is going to be costly, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to require resources. And I'm just going to say here, what I say in every of these conversations, which is that the bank stands ready. You can use the World Bank's name in vain. We're trying to get the word out that World Bank has a number of resources that we can bring to the fore, some technical expertise, but also some financial resources through our new MDTF, multi-donor trust fund for the blue economy called ProBlue. So you can count on us, call on us. Thank you again very much for bringing us in this conversation. And we look forward to continuing our participation in all these processes all the way and including in Lisbon. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Bruno?
Well, I'll start again from the subsidy point of view, and indeed, if we can get rid of a number of very harmful subsidies, that would be a strong progress. In Unep, we qualify any fossil fuel related subsidy as harmful, very harmful. It's necessary to cut them and to channel the money that we use in this to other means. So if we can create this link, getting rid of harmful subsidies that are fossil fuel related notably, and looking at the pollution that is also a byproduct of fossil energy and plastic notably, and invest all that money into restoration, conservation, and protection of the ocean, then probably we can achieve a number of our goals. But that necessitates a lot of courage, political, and good data, good science that we have around the table, and we've understood that in the conversation. So it's time for action again. Thanks.
Thank you. And Duarte, you have the last word.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a lot of responsibility. Well, I organized here in the UK 3 Blue Talks, and my feeling was that there are very high expectations, especially amongst young generations. 2 out of these 3 Blue Talks were focused on younger generations, and these feel that they are waiting for decisions, they are waiting for solutions. And there's one of the speakers, a young girl that went to COP26 in Glasgow and was one of the speakers in our events. As she said, no gesture is too small. So everybody must be involved, everybody must be on board. And if I may add, no gesture is too small because the ocean is too big to fail. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Duarte. Let me just close by thanking all the speakers. I think we have a very clear message out of this session. The time is now, and we look forward for a UN Oceans Conference in Lisbon, who will be welcoming an agreement and start thinking about implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Let's just bring to your attention that next week we will have the 3rd Blue Talk here in Geneva. It's a high-level briefing on the conference with the special envoy of the conference, Peter Thompson, who will be virtually with us. And let me also take this opportunity to bring you to your attention a few other events that we are planning here in Geneva. Tomorrow we have a discussion on the climate tipping points, a proposition for a new report of the IPCC cycle of reports. And then next week we are celebrating World Environment Day, and we have also a few events in preparation of that main day, and also of the Stockholm conference taking place in Stockholm. So we will have a discussion on human rights and the environment, celebrating the 50 years of the Stockholm Declaration on Monday here at the International Environment House. Thank you all for your attention.